Today we're going to paint a white rabbit in gouache, well, a black and white rabbit, a house rabbit. And I've sketched out the rabbit shape on the Clairefontaine grey paint-on paper. It's wonderful because I use it for all sorts of media, but it does work really well with gouache. I love the grey and their green grey, their terre verte. So I'm mixing black and burnt sienna together for the eyes, leaving an area for the pupil just because it dries quicker this way, and I have a little bit more control. I'm using a thin brush from a set of Pebeo all-purpose nylon brushes, and then I'm adding darker areas around the outer part of the eye, and just with black, and outlining its nose and mouth as well, just to make it a little bit easier for me to spot and blend things in, because don't forget, that's the beauty of gouache, is that even when it's dry you can layer another colour, and with a damp brush you can soften those layers together, which is really crucial in blending, especially for mottled areas, for animals' fur and feathers. I absolutely love it. Now, I think I made the error of picking up crimson rather than cadmium red, but it doesn't really matter. I used crimson and a little bit of burnt sienna and white for the pink part of the ear. Cadmium red will work as well. You wouldn't need to add the burnt sienna to the cadmium red because of it being more orangey based. I've added a bit more burnt sienna to the crimson here for the darker part of the ear as it goes dark. Now, don't forget, the crucial part of gouache is that it dries flat, matte and slightly darker. If you think about when you put emulsion paint on the wall. And he's got a little pink nose and little pink pouches above his top lip, so I've put that in, and I'm being a little bit random around the outer part of that because it's just a little bit easier for blending and makes it look more natural and less like a illustration or cartoon. So I've mixed a slightly darker version with a little bit more brown and a tiny bit of black to outline that area, but that will also mean I can soften and blend it out to make them more three-dimensional rather than flat. I want the darker lines to be the internal parts of that, so the nostril area, and then it will blend outwards into the nose and outwards into the lips. I really do love gouache for animals and birds, because it really does allow you to make so many layers, and you can go from light to dark or dark to light. It really doesn't matter. I prefer to go depending on the fur really, and you'll see here how I work, and that I've chosen the grey particularly because of the black and white tones in the rabbit, and I'm using a longish brush with a little bit of white, slightly diluted, so the white of the eye isn't really standing out too much. It stands out quite a lot at the moment, but it will sink in because it will always absorb a little bit of the colour that's underneath. And I'm using that colour to go around the nose area and lip, and that will blend in nicely with the pink with a clean damp brush. But basically what I'm doing is I'm adding all of the white patches on the rabbit first. He's a black and white patchy rabbit, and it does mean that you do have to constantly refer to the reference images that you're using. However, what will happen with the white gouache is, because I've got it dilute on my brush, it will not stay white. And you might think, well, why is that important? Well, the grey paper will show through the white, and it will tone the white down, which means when it's dry I can build up another layer of white, and maybe even another layer of white, reducing the transparency each time, so less water each time I do it, and it works so well, it really does. If I was doing this on white paper, I would probably do the underpainting in a pale grey. So using the grey paper really does make a big difference. So I'm looking at the reference image to see where all the lighter areas are. I'm not being overly careful because I know I'm going to go over all of this because this is an underpainting layer. However, I am still making sure I'm going in the direction that the fur is growing or going, and it does make a big difference because you can't hide all your brush strokes. So if your brush strokes are working for you, it makes life so much easier. It really does. I can't drive home how important that is. If you just scribble with your brush, it looks like I'm scribbling, but I'm scribbling with purpose and I'm going in the right direction. If I was suddenly going horizontal, it wouldn't look right when we paint over the top. It would look a little bit more unskilled, in the sense that you haven't really observed what you're looking at, because it is all about observation when you're doing things like this. I'm now going in with the black to cover the black areas, and I know that the black will dry flat and matte, and it won't dry as black as it is because I'm diluting it. So don't forget, whenever you're diluting a paint, you're reducing the transparency, even by slightly, and that will go with any opaque paints, including oils and acrylics, and even an opaque watercolour only remains opaque until you dilute it, and then it starts to become semi-opaque and then semi-transparent. So I'm still, even though it's black and you can't see brush marks or anything in this, I'm still following the direction of the fur, because it's just easier if you do that. If you get into a habit with it, it makes it so much easier because you won't forget, even when you're doing things that you may not or may not think you'll see when it's drying. But gouache always dries, sometimes in more random ways. So I'm flicking out slightly with this little brush to make the hair look fluffy. I often use smaller brushes when I'm working with animals because I know I can work quickly, and it means I'm slightly more careful. If I start using rake or comb brushes and that kind of thing on small animals and smaller paintings, I'm not careful. So I have to rein myself in by using a smaller brush, but just work quicker. So you can see the whole of his face is taking shape now. But you can't see the grey underneath. But when this dries, I can, if it dries dark, I know I can put a highlight on it. If it dries light, I know I can put a darker fur on top with neater black. So I'm covering the whole of the body now. So this is all of the black areas. I'm basically blocking in all the zones of colour, which will make life so much easier when we come to do the other areas. Bear in mind, this is a very short demonstration of about 20 minutes, so it just makes life easier, and sometimes that's what you have to think about. It doesn't mean that I won't spend a lot of time on it. If I was doing a pet portrait, I would still block in this way. However, I would take between 8 and 14 hours on even something this size, to make sure I've got the hair in exactly the right way and the tones how I want it. So you can see the direction of my paint is following the direction that the hair would be going. A little bit of shading and darker outlining of his paws where it meets the surface that they're sitting on. It just gives it a little bit of weight. You can see there actually that the white on the chest has now dried, and it looks patchy because the grey's coming through it, and that's exactly what I wanted. Those little toes, just emphasising those a little bit more. With not perfect lines because it's covered in fur, so you don't want, again, to look like an illustration unless you're aiming for an illustration. You could do some of that with a permanent black liner pen if you struggle with fine lines, but I'd say really try to work your way around it and understand how to get fine lines in paint, because the skill is getting the paint thin and dilute and still with pigment, not runny and transparent, which is what happens. I'm back in with the white and then back in with the black to make a sort of greyish tone for the shaded parts. If you imagine the rabbit has the light source from our left side, so the light is on the left of this image, the right side of the rabbit is slightly darker. So this is sort of using the pinky tones with a little bit of black to make a sort of purpley grey, really, because we are a really limited palette here, just black, white, crimson, don't forget I use, but you can use cadmium red or burnt sienna. I'm using the white to put on the markings. Now, it's not a pure white, there is a tiny bit of black in there because that part of the ear is in shadow, so the white isn't as vibrant. So by putting it on top of the black, it will also awaken the black that's underneath slightly, just to dull it down even more. And I do like the paint to dry between each layer where possible. And I'm back in with the neat white on top of the white fur that's now gone grey. So the white is still slightly diluted, but it will create a second layer on top, and you can see how much whiter that is than the dried colour underneath. And this is where I'm using not quite a rigger, it's more of a liner brush. Slightly longer bristles and quite thin, so I can do long, thin strokes. And I'm looking at the lightest parts of the hair now, the fur. And that does mean that I can leave some of those greyer tones from the underpainting just there, because it's already dulled down enough for me. And I'm flicking out a little bit for the fluffiness of his chest. Again, always look at how the fur is growing. Whether it's fur, feathers or hair, it's all the same stuff, and it will all do the same thing. So there isn't really much of a difference in how you approach it, unless you're doing a real close-up of feathers and then you can see each feather shape. But from a distance, feathers will react in the same way as fur when you're painting them. So you can see, look how much brighter that white is. This is permanent white, by the way. That's my gouache white of choice rather than zinc white or any other white. I find the permanent white much more opaque and vibrant, which is great for doing this. I'm using the Winsor & Newton designer gouache. I've used quite a few different ones over the years, and I prefer that, but that doesn't mean that you will. Find a gouache that works for you. These are the tubes. I have squeezed my tubes into a palette that I use often, but you can use them straight. But the thing to remember is, if you're just using a palette, don't throw the paint away, because you can re-wet them and use them again. Karen Dash do an absolutely fabulous fan colour gouache in really large blocks in a tin, which are wonderful because they're already solid. You just maybe spray them before you start, and then you can get painting. Spray them with water. Here's still white, fairly dilute, but not overly dilute, just dilute enough for me to flow with the brush to get the fur in the direction and the length I want. And you can see that it really does pick out and stand out much more than you'd think. So even when it dries, because it's got another layer of white underneath it, it will stay brighter than the original underpainting, and that's why we do it in this way and in this sequence. So on the face value, you think, oh well, it's kind of done, but you need to add your highlights and things. Now with black, fur, feathers, hair, doesn't really matter. If you just use black and white to highlight black, it will look grey. So if you're doing grey hair, black hair on a person and you try to highlight it with black, it won't always look right. My advice would be to use blue in the black. Now for here, I'm not using any blue because the black that I've got is Mars black, and it is a bluey black tone. So when you mix a bit of white with that, you don't get grey, you get a bluey grey, which works really, really well. If you're working with something like a lamp black, that is often a brown black. And you can see there that it does look bluer. So I'm doing black with a tiny, tiny bit of white. I really can't emphasize that enough. A really small amount of white and a small amount of water to do lots of short strokes, again in the direction of the fur. And it means you can cut into other areas of the white if you've gone too far, and just really build up those layers of fluffiness. Now the way that the face has dried, it means that I can use neat black. You can't see it straight away, and it is something that you can only see close up, but I know it's there, and it still catches the light in a different way, and it really does mean that it looks authentic and cute, because that's what you got to think about when you're doing something like this, especially if it's somebody's pet. When I'm doing a pet portrait, I will also ask for the personality of whatever animal it is, because I like to try and put that in if I can. Usually you can tell by the glint in the eyes or something like that. I had to do a portrait of 2 cats and a chihuahua, and I asked about the cats and whatever, and it was clear to me that the chihuahua was a spoiled little prince, and because he looked just so proud of himself alongside the 2 cats, he looked superior to them both. So I made sure I put that in, and the owner of the animals and who requested the painting was overjoyed, because I'd got him looking just as he is in real life. You can actually see there that the black is covering up really well over the top, so you can get different tones and textures, because that's what fur is. It's all layering. The thing to think of when you're doing white fur or white hair is that the grey bits are shadows. It's shadows cast by the layer of fur above it, so you don't want to go too wild with that. You really do have a lot of thought to go into anything like this with fur or feathers or hair. It's about the layering, it's about the textures, and it's about the tone. I've slightly lightened behind the rabbit's head with a greyish colour, very subtle, because I know that'll dry darker, which will bring the head forward from his body. And I'm using that little bit of grey just to add a few more darker tones of shadow in the rabbit's chest and around his mouth a little bit, just to add a bit more depth, because it wasn't looking as three-dimensional as I would have liked. Now bear in mind, I think I painted the whole thing, but there's a bit of editing here. I think that this whole painting took me half an hour from start to finish whilst I was teaching, because it was a demonstration piece, whereas my real pet portraits would take days. But it goes to show you can get a decent effect quite quickly once you follow the rules of layering and working out what colours you need to use. A few more lighter highlights. Because it dries fairly quickly, it enables you to see where you need to correct or add lighter parts or darker aspects to it. I was worried that you wouldn't see his eyes, so I slightly used a little bit of grey just around the edge of the eye, just to bring it out from the black, because the eyes are very dark. It was a dark brown that we started with, if you remember. So I'm using black, fairly diluted. I was toying with the idea of using a pen, but I thought, no, I will use black, roll it around on my tile, make it really inky, and get a nice thin line for the whiskers and any longer hairs on the little rabbit's face. And again, you do have to constantly look at where they are, and it's fine to turn your painting round, because there's areas of it that were wet. I didn't really want to drag my hand over it, but doing it this way and brushing downwards meant that I'd be able to have control over those whiskers. Otherwise I'd have used a pen when it was totally dry. So other than the shadow, that's it finished, and the shadow is very, very dilute black. But what I do is I wet the paper first, so it almost looks like a shadow anyway, but don't forget, when it dries that will disappear. I wet the paper first so I can put very dilute black on, which I'm doing now, and that so it diffuses and spreads, and I haven't got really harsh lines that I need to try to get rid of. But because it's gouache, it does mean I can get rid of it with a damp or wet brush. See, I hadn't wet down here. You can see that it didn't diffuse in the same way, so I'm going to have to go in with a bit more water and soften those edges. I'm using a flat brush for that. But if you notice, most of the brushes I've used haven't gone any bigger than a 1/2 inch flat. And there we have the finished little bunny rabbit. It really is fun working with gouache to layer the fur and feathers. So why not give it a go? This is me probably fiddling a bit too much, doing the little finishing touches, or being a just adder. If you've seen any of my reels, you'll know what the just adder is. And I'm just making sure it's as it looks in the reference image, and you can see some of the shadow on the floor is already drying. Just doing a few little jaggedy edges of fur around the ears to keep it fluffy and in keeping with the rest of the body. But there is the finished piece.